Okay, look, I'll begin now. It's a great pleasure to welcome Chris Urwin, who's actually in Melbourne at the moment, but soon to go to the US. He's going to present on a topic which I think is going to be of interest to many general anthropologists, archaeologists, and indeed philosophers in the audience, so welcome. The title is Archaeology, a Western Science, Indigenous Interpretation of the Subsurface and the Papuan Gulf, Papua New Guinea. So Chris is a postdoc fellow in anthropology at the National Museum of Natural History in the Smithsonian Institution, USA. Obviously, he's still in Melbourne, but he said he's leaving in a couple of months. His current research examines narratives of Indigenous voyaging and American collecting through the social histories of Pacific canoes acquired by the Smithsonian Institution. He completed his PhD at the Monash University in 2019, and he worked in villages in Orokolo Bay, PNG, to establish radiocarbon chronologies for ancestral sites, but alongside the program of documenting local oral traditions. Since his doctoral work, he's been a curator in archaeology at Museums Victoria and also a research fellow at Monash Indigenous Studies Centre. First of all, I'd like to do the formal acknowledgement that the University of Western Australia acknowledges that we're on Noongar Whadjuk land and that the Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of the land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs and knowledge. And we acknowledge the traditional owners of the Whadjuk Bujab Perth land that the university is on. We have a number of exciting launches this week. Some are virtual, some are real, some are books that have turned up in various seminars in the morning and others are still offshore. But just to draw your attention to 3 or 4 very different volumes. First of all, Ontologies of Rock Art, apparently the first international review of the ontological turn in rock art, edited by Martin Poor and Oscar Adabia. Then we have the Shipwrecks of the Roaring Forties, the results of the major ARC linkage project with about 20 or 30 partners, but majority Maritime Museum and UWA, and edited by Jeremy Green and Al Patterson. And not the least, the major laureate program of work done by Emily Dotsoro and in collaboration with 3 or 4 other editors on the history of Pacific prehistory, historiographic approaches, and Francophile archaeology in Oceania. So some major publications, some great work, and I think profiling the diversity of research which is carried out at UWA in our partnerships. So just to remind you, in case you had forgotten, the seminars have moved to 3 p.m. on Friday. This was done to suit the majority, so I expect to see the majority online. We've already had a couple of interesting presentations, I think. We are now moving towards a range of presentations from our colleagues at the West Australian Museum next week, talking about the Indigenous engagement and community engagement at the New WA Museum, the Museum Bula Badip, then talks around hunter-gatherer archaeology, scientific discoveries from the Chao Chak Wing Museum, field school excavations on Noongar land, geography archaeology collaborations, and Indian Ocean themes. So a really diverse and quite deep group of offerings throughout the semesters. So to remind you about next week, Annie Carson, Moya Smith and Corelli Sauter, all from the West Australian Museum, will be presenting on the objects which date from Olduvai Gorge through to ancestral lines of Aboriginal people in Australia, through to contemporary objects that were still being used by communities in the Pilbara. Okay, Smile, you're on camera. The commentary chat that you make will be visible, so please keep it to questions or points of clarification, which can be shared with the group overall, and just the copyright notice as well, in terms of the University's Copyright Act. So, without any ado, it's a great pleasure to hand over to Chris Urwin, and he's now going to share his screen, and I'll try and pop out his face and get rid of the rest of ours. Thank you.
Okay, how's that?
Not yet.
Not yet. Just a bit of lag.
Yep, there we go.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Peter, and I would just like to add my acknowledgement of the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the land from which I'm joining you, and acknowledge their elders past and present, and also acknowledge the elders of the Larry Hairu and Kovakovu village communities who really participated massively in this research, and my thoughts are with them at the moment, certainly at the moment with the PNG in a bit of crisis with COVID, as much of the world is. So I'm hoping that the situation improves over there. And you can see on the right here, this is the Kovakovu village with which I worked in 2015. And so I suppose the title of my talk is perhaps deliberately provocative, and hopefully it reeled you in. I realise Peter was saying that there's philosophers and anthropologists and archaeologists here, so I'm bound to disappoint at least one group of people, so I'm sorry for that.
Can I just interrupt for a moment, Chris? Sorry, it's Ken here, Ken Mulvaney. We're actually seeing not your presentation screen, but your information screen. So we're seeing two of your slides at the same time.
Okay.
So your mouse key doesn't correspond. So I think you have to. I'm not an IT expert, but I can recognise the wrong screen.
Yes, well, that makes two of us, but I think I did everything right, so it might be kind of in the the problem of it going across to. What are you seeing now?
Ask me if he's got one or two screens.
Have you got one or two screens there, Chris?
So I have two, but the other one is closed down, so it should be okay. Normally it's okay.
So can you put it on slideshow presentation as opposed to the audio?
Yes, so that's what I did before. Okay. Here we go. I'll put it on slideshow.
Yeah, we're getting your presentation view. So it probably doesn't matter if you don't mind. We don't mind. We'll just your face over the top of the other. Yeah.
Wouldn't be 2020, 2021 without some technical glitches. So, so can you, is that it? I'll just go with this.
That's good for us.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so chose a bit of a provocative title. And in one sense, the question, is archaeology a Western science? Answers itself. It depends how we define the term archaeology. And certainly some of us may debate the appropriateness of the word science. But in common use, the word archaeology refers to a practice that emerged in Northern and Central Europe. And so ours is this kind of earthy, methodical discipline which investigates the past through things and landscapes. Archaeology is obviously highly interdisciplinary, and it calls on techniques used in nuclear science and chemistry and other fields. And scholars like Bruce Trigger have traced the origins of archaeology, suggesting that it emerged after centuries of European antiquarianism, sort of nascent artifact and landscape studies that often focused on highly enigmatic ruins unknown in the written records, like the megalithic monuments of Europe. So in our Australian context, here's a few of the sort of relevant books that you might have read about Australian archaeology and history of archaeology. In our own context, I think Billy Griffiths is to be commended for bringing the history of archaeology in Australia to a pretty large audience, which I think is no small task. And Griffiths really traced the proliferation and professionalisation of archaeology in the 1960s, driven by scholars like Isabel McBride and John Mulvaney. And Tom Griffiths previously traced the story of Australian antiquarians in the early 1900s, people who essentially ransacked Aboriginal sites for artefacts and human remains, and broadly denied Aboriginal antiquity in Australia, and especially those associated with the National Museum of Victoria. But it's worth mentioning that systematic archaeologies in Australia date back to around 1920s, when Norman Tyndale and Herbert Hale conducted their excavations at Nyalt and Tartanga. And Ian McNiven and Lynette Russell have traced the colonial culture of archaeology, which certainly was the case in the Tyndale and Hale excavations, which sort of attributed the various layers of the various strata and artifacts to different cultures displacing one another through time. So it had a real racialist tinge to it. And so today, archaeology is a diverse and globalised practice. It's got diverse cultural influences in countries like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa. Many research projects are directed by Indigenous community members who may incorporate cultural protocols and rituals to engage with their ancestors during excavations and surveys. And so the archaeological work may look conventional, but the past in these circumstances is treated as a living dimension of the present. The narratives that are written about the past may incorporate Indigenous oral traditions and ecological knowledge. And I think these diverse cultural perspectives really enrich archaeology. They're contributing new angles from which to see the evidence and new ways of interpreting the past. So in this sense, even if we're defining archaeology conventionally, there's a sense in which this originally or ostensibly Northern and Central European practice is no longer Western, in that it's becoming a disparate and culturally diverse practice informed by many worldviews. But what of alternative archaeologies? I think much of this, so the Western origins and recent transformations of archaeology are pretty well known. I think most of you would be familiar with those. Far less well known and written about are sort of truly alternative archaeologies. Archaeologies which did not originate from the same kind of trajectory. And so in this paper, I'm going to describe a form of archaeology which people conduct as part of daily life in the Papuan Gulf of Papua New Guinea's south coast. And I want to conclude this discussion by talking about some global examples of these kind of practices. I think these practices might be a key missing puzzle piece too in discussions of how oral traditional societies construct, sustain and maintain knowledge about the past. Okay, so my journey of discovery with this topic began in a place called Orokolo Bay, down here on the south coast of Papua New Guinea, obviously just sort of northeast of the Torres Strait Islands in the huge curving tropics of this part of Papua New Guinea. And the modern day capital of PNG, Port Moresby, is just located over here on the coast there. And they're two quite different ecologies. Port Moresby is very dry, savanna sort of environment, and the Papuan Gulf is very much the tropics. And so, as I said, my journey of discovery with this began by accident, starting a PhD at Monash University in Orokolo Bay. And so in September 2015, I arrived there with a colleague, Henry Arafai from the PNG National Museum and Art Gallery. Now, this place is pretty well known already in anthropology and material culture studies, museums. So Pacific Museum collections are full of the kind of striking material culture from the ceremonies of Orokolo Bay. And just to show you this next slide, you can see here a haro mask from a particular ceremony which was preceded the highly sacred Hevehe and Kovave ceremonies. This was one of the more light-hearted ceremonies and it's very famous. You know, this image on the right is from the Met Museum collections in New York, and these are from a private collection in Melbourne. And so in the 1920s and 1930s, the Australian government anthropologist Francis Edgar Williams worked in Orokolo Bay for around 18 months, documenting people's social and ceremonial lives, and that led to pretty key publication. And so and so today the Hevehe ceremonies are gone, but the shoreline of Orokolo Bay is certainly no less busy. It's still the main highway of foot traffic between various coastal villages, most of which are located just behind a line of coconut and hibiscus trees at the top of the shoreline. So this September trip was our second journey to Orokolo Bay. And on the first trip, we spent a lot of time talking to the elders of the two village communities, establishing what might be a some productive research, and particularly establishing what their priorities for the archaeological research might be. Some of the things which emerged from this process was that locals of Orokolo Bay were interested in aspects of the archaeological science, things such as radiocarbon dating, which might be able to inform how old some of these ancestral places were, and also pottery analysis, which had the potential to reveal who their ancestors were trading with in the past.
Hey, Chris, I'll just get you to click that out into slide view. We've just got your previews on the left. You should be able to easily bring that into full slide format. You can't? Okay, no worries.
Is that working?
Yeah.
No, okay, sorry, mate. Go back.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
So what are you saying? You're saying like half, or?
No, it's good. It's about 3/4. It's fine.
Okay. Not really sure what the problem is, how to fix it at this end. Okay. All right, where was I? Okay, so in this field season, in September, we were due to start our program of surveys and excavations at past village sites, which are today located 2 or 3 kilometres inland on ancient beach ridges. So in the weeks that followed, we were surveying in the Orokolo Bay hinterland. Local experts in oral tradition very graciously introduced us to their ancestors' village sites, most of which were littered with cultural materials, scatters of pottery, shellfish remains, animal bone and stone artefacts, all of which spoke of the varied activities of village life. And these pot sherds too were evidence of exchange, because there's no known tradition of pottery making in this part of Papua New Guinea. Pottery was almost certainly traded in from hundreds of kilometres to the east along the coast. So at the time of colonisation, Indigenous trade networks very much interlinked. The south coast of Papua New Guinea, you can see here, this is the Hiri trade route, and this trade took place between Motu villages of today's Port Moresby region and Papuan Gulf villages in the region I was talking about before. And archaeologists like Ian McNiven are working on understanding just how exchange has actually interconnected this whole region as part of the Coral Sea cultural interaction sphere. And the Hiri trade is a really key part of that connectivity. And so Motu villages would produce tens of thousands of pots, earthenware pots each year for exchange. And these would be placed in these vast canoe vessels made from lashed together canoes with a superstructure on top. You can see that here. And then transported all the way into the Papuan Gulf. And the Motu people would stay in the Papuan Gulf for several months of each year. And so it's very much it's a highly engaged form of exchange. And so they're waiting for the wind to change so that they could return home. And we can, okay. So we assumed, as you tend to do with an archaeological project, that this research project might break new ground in the archaeology. Archaeological research in the Papuan Gulf so far has been relatively patchy, although with some high quality research projects conducted in amongst that. And so even though the Papuan Gulf has several hundred kilometres of curving coastline, as you can see here, it's really only in the Kikori River, Parari River and Aleman language regions that previous archaeology has taken place. In the 1970s, James Rhodes, who I think is online, carried out a pretty remarkable ethno-archaeological project with Kairi or Rumu speaking people of the Kikori River region for his PhD at the ANU. Jim Rhodes sought to understand land use regimes through time and show that people have been cultivating sago palm near large villages within the past sort of 1500 years. Ron van der Wal and David Frankel worked over in Kerema, riding around on motorbikes looking for pottery-rich sites, which dated all of them to within the past 500 years. And Jim Rhodes also worked in Orokolo Bay, where I'll be talking about, at the site of Popo, and really established that place was going to be very important for understandings of the Hiri trade. More recently, Bruno David, Ian McNiven, Lara Lamb and Bryce Barker have worked in the Picori River region, sort of refining the cultural chronologies there, and sort of showing these pulses of village occupation in that region within the past sort of 1500 years, and even some earlier sites in limestone rock shelters and the like. And in the Koori lowlands down here, Rob Skelly and Bruno David have worked with Koori lowland communities to build a kind of reliable radiocarbon and ceramic sequence. And so that sequence is showing that people have been present in this coastline near Orokolo Bay for the past sort of 2,800 years. And also that this region is it's a highly active coastline. It's actually accumulating at around 3 meters per year. So that actually has a huge impact on, obviously, on how people situate their villages through time. And so, of course, we hope to use radiocarbon dating to add to this picture to show how old the sites were, pottery analyses to find out who villagers were trading with, and analyses of food remains to investigate diet and how food was acquired. So what really happened? Well, in the coming weeks of our collaborative work, it became apparent that in one sense, we were not breaking new ground. So Kaivakovu and Larihairu villages had pre-existing interpretations of the subsurface remains that we would tend to think of as archaeological or geomorphological. And this is knowledge that they gain in the process, in the course of everyday life, just by living and working in these places. And so by walking the land and working the soil at their ancestors' villages, people were constantly unearthing and remembering the buried past. So people in Orokolo Bay and across Papua New Guinea and the Pacific Islands are in the business of making the surface and subsurface visible. And certainly archaeologists working in the Pacific will be well familiar with this. Much of the work occurs in the process of agriculture, for which people extensively modify soils, plots and fields. And so when an agricultural plot, as you can see in this picture here, is re-established from fallow, they're clearing obviously all this overgrown vegetation and partially clearing that and then burning it off. In the Koori lowlands, where Rob and Bruno works, people dig drainage ditches up to 1.5 meters deep. And in their archaeological excavations, surveys, it was very much a matter of often finding these sites where the drainage ditches have been dug and where you can see the pottery eroding out of the profile. The soil is a lot drier in Orokolo Bay, but people are still digging drainage holes that are about 25 or 30 centimetres deep to mitigate flooding. Seasonally, people are obviously planting. They're planting bananas, taro, sweet potato, all those kind of plants. And although the technology may have changed through time, so obviously metal spades are used today, but these activities were ongoing well before colonisation of this region by the British in 1884. And in fact, some of our excavations in 2015 uncovered evidence of older excavations, sort of areas of the stratigraphy where we could see that people have dug post holes into deeper and older artifact-laden sediments. Of course, construction as well involves deep excavation. When houses and other structures are built, wide foundation posts have to be driven into the ground. And in fact, in the early colonial era, we have reason to think that people were engaging even deeper with the subsurface to build houses because of these 15-metre tall long houses they were constructing in the 1920s and 1930s, which I showed you on a slide earlier. So in 2015, people were frequently cultivating and building at their ancestors' villages. and especially perhaps because some people are now relocating inland for fear of rising sea levels and unpredictable tides. And that's a pattern that I think Colin Filer and others have observed in other parts of Papua New Guinea. And so the effect of all this work, of course, is visibility. So when we visit some of these sites, we can see what I've shown on the picture there, although you're obviously having a bit of trouble seeing all the pictures, but you can see sherds spilling out of the ground surrounding plants. So a focus of local interpretations and investigations of the subsurface is the past village site called Popo, which is where Jim Rhodes excavated test pits in the 1970s. And this oral traditional site is about 1.5 kilometres wide or long, 500 metres wide, and it's situated 2.5 kilometres inland. And people from throughout Orokolo Bay and also up to 125 kilometres to the east tie in their genealogies to this site. It's a really key migration place for Elemen language speaking peoples. The stories about Popo date back to around between 16 and 7 generations ago, and I'll be interested to see what if Jim Rhodes can recall what was told to him. I think we've had a bit of an email exchange about that, but it's fascinating to see how these stories progress through time. And so in the deep past, in the stories about Popo, the ancestors settled the land, but first they used land-forming magic to make the beach on which this village is situated. And so the place is known simultaneously through genealogies, but also through cosmological origin stories that are talking about the very deep past when the very earth was formed. And locals actually distinguish between these two chronologies. They talk about the ancestral stories being about mythical beings and spiritual beings, and the more recent stories being about human beings. So they're actually talking about the difference in the way they think about the people that populate these stories. And so the stories also recount that the place was divided into clan or tribal estates, each of which was built by a different tribe when they arrived at the place of Popo. And you can see here a remarkable map by Hape Hai of the Tapi Lariharu clan. And this just shows the kind of breakdown of the different estates of Popo. And so within the local oral traditions, there is a sequence of occupation, if you like. And so it's these southerly estates that were established first in the oral traditions, the places that are collectively known as Popo Uku and Maria Ita. They were settled 16 generations ago by the scouts, by the first ancestors to arrive, and they built the very first longhouse at that place. And then other tribes established places to the north at Maipi and Maruka and built their own longhouses there before people moved to emerging places to the west at Aitaherehiru and Kwava Ipi, places which in the stories, these places form later. So Aitahiru, for example, is a cosmological origin story about that place in which it forms as an offshore island. And people talk, you can see here, this creek is sort of called on in these stories as evidence that this place was once an offshore island and was later joined to the mainland. And so you get a lot of these stories in Orokolo Bay, stories which essentially commemorate ecological changes and changes in the landscape. Okay, so people are constantly working the land where their ancestors once lived here because this high ground is very fertile, it's good for agriculture. And at some of Popo's suburbs, stratigraphic evidence of the deep, timeless past can be found beneath the surface. And so you can see here these distinctive layers of black sand here at the Kwava Ipi and Maruka excavations. Now, in a sort of archaeological frame or way of understanding it chronologically, we could say that these are two discrete events. They're not necessarily chronologically related. And we would perhaps say that you know, these are sands that were washed down from Papua New Guinea's volcanic Cordillera, the high mountains of the highlands, washed down by rivers, and then they were deposited by the tides on the beach. And as I said, these beaches are emerging at 3 meters per year to the south. And so that's one explanation for it. But in local parlance, these sands have a very different meaning and chronology. So as Kaivikovu village oral historian Paul Mahiro told us, the sands were laid by his ancestors when they made Popo and the world itself. Paul explains here, you can see the story, and this is Paul here, he's the son of a well-known Orokolo Bay historian, one of the first published Indigenous oral historians. And so he explained that two ancestors, Miai and Lairua, laid the sand as they travelled. He says, in their hand they had a sand, which is kekere. This sand was a black sand brought from the west. They'd already spread the black sand, so when you see on that part of the land, there is a little bit of black soil from Kwava Ipi all the way to Aitohiru and beyond, because they were chased away, they didn't complete their work. So here Paul's saying that not only is this black sand in some sense evidence of cosmological action, it's also evidence of the way in which these actions took place. Because the ancestors were chased away as they were working, this sand is actually thin. You don't see thick layers of the black sand at the place called Popo. Okay, so people also read aspects of the spatiality and antiquity of village sites into the surface and subsurface of Popo. So this is actually a different kind of chronological register. We're now talking more about what locals call the human beings, not the ancestral being, not the spiritual beings and the mythical beings. And so while the entire village of Popo is under cultivation currently, or aspects of each different estate, the amount of cleared forest and the area covered by garden plots varies quite a lot. You can see here a rough breakdown of how much each estate has been cleared, along with other evidence of subsurface disturbance at these sites. And so during our collaborative research at Popo, it became clear to me that there was a correlation between the intensiveness of cultivation at particular sites and their perceived antiquity. And so in general, the more extensively cleared and cultivated a given suburb or estate had been, the older this place was in the oral traditions. Almost certainly this has something to do with the process of encountering pottery and shell and bone at these sites. And so the more southerly estates of Popo have these really rich accumulations of cultural materials, large stone artifacts, shell middens and the like. And these remind people of when Popo was a coastal place that was inhabited by many people. The suburbs just to the north are slightly less archaeologically rich. They've got a lot of pottery that comes out of the ground. And here you can see Kaivavore High holding one such pot sherd. But then the estates to the west that are remembered as being more recent, they have a very, very slight archaeological signature. There's not many archaeological remains in those places. Now, the way in which these interpretations are made is perhaps best expressed by Johnson Opa, who is a colleague of Monash University archaeologist Rob Skelly in the Koori Lowlands. So during their archaeological work in 2010, surveys were conducted at an ancestral site called Hopo, not to be confused with Popo, and the site belonged to the Miaro clan. So several members of this clan were working with Rob on the excavations. Johnson is from the Levahuku clan, but he'd been granted access to this land for his garden. So based on his experience working the land, he offered the Monash and Miaro clan archaeologists his spatial interpretation of the site. And so Rob and Bruno have described this interaction like this. According to Johnson, site OJT is well away from what was once the main domestic area of the Hopo ancestral village. Johnson professed to know little of Popo's cultural history. He justified his opposition of the opinion of the ancient village layout on his gardening experience, confidently suggesting we could find few pottery sherds at OJT compared with the eastern part of Hopo, which represents the centre of village domestic activity. And we can see here what Johnson's talking about in these fantastic photos of Orokolo Bay, or photo of Orokolo Bay in 1932, taken by Francis Edgar Williams. You can see here the cooking going on just on the edge of the village, near the uvi, which were the women's houses or the family houses. And you can see here the ceremonies are taking place near the ceremonial structures, the Iravo. Those are probably junior Iravo because they're not huge, but this is where the dancing ground is. And here you can see some of the work of Martin Fowler, who's a well-known architect who's worked a lot in Papua New Guinea. And Martin Fowler did his PhD at Melbourne University on the spatiality of these villages and what they looked like through time. And he's drawn this fantastic sketch of what these villages might have looked like, just working from photographs like these. And you can see obviously laid out with the Iravo at the centre of the village and then sort of domestic spaces around the outside. And so, of course, Johnson modestly claims to know little of the stories in front of the Miaro clan members, opting to defer to them, but it's pretty likely he would have been well aware of the oral traditions about Hopo and about the longhouse that was situated somewhere within that area in the past. And so he's then interpreting the density of pottery that he encounters day to day below the surface, not just on the surface, and offering interpretation of where different ceremonial domestic zones might be located. Johnson also combines this knowledge with another piece of information that's present at the site, which is a stone. And this stone is interpreted by Johnson and by other members of the team at the time as a magic stone, which marked and thus memorializes where the Iravo was located. So these kind of stones are located all across this part of Papua New Guinea. They're very important and ancestrally. They memorialize places. But the interesting thing about it, and the thing that obviously destabilizes perhaps how, saying myself as a Western archaeologist, how we think about these kind of memorial items, is that this stone is actually alive. It's something that, according to people in Orokolo Bay and Kuri Lowlands, it moves around at night. There is a sense in which it's a living memorial. Okay, so on to the archaeological investigations of Papua and just kind of briefly discussing how those kind of understandings of the place might compare with the kind of local ongoing daily investigations of the stratigraphy and the artifacts. Our excavations took place at 8 different locations and we excavated 6 particular estates within Papua to see how they related and to see how the village might have changed through time. So we used 35 carbon dates and Bayesian statistics to look at the chronology of the site, and broadly it shows that Papua was occupied for around 500 years, from 700 to 200 years before present, roughly. And through time, as you can see from the sort of lit up parts of the estates, this village expanded, contracted, and shifted through time as people moved into the village and then gradually moved south following the shoreline, which was emerging at a very rapid rate to the south at around 300 years ago. You can see that this sequence of occupation is somewhat different to that expressed in the oral tradition. So people here are first living at Myupi and Maruka, and then village is sort of expanding, and then expanding as Quava Ipi actually emerges. So there's a couple of different explanations for this. Obviously we can say, well, perhaps because the chronologies are very, very similar for this more recent period. Obviously the oral traditional chronologies are saying that these are the later estates of Popo, as is the radiocarbon. We could say, well, maybe it's that oral traditions are really accurate within the last sort of 200 years or so. But another alternative explanation, and the one that I'm putting forward here, is that actually the material remains at these places is playing a role in the way in which the stories and the place are articulated. And so people are actually using their encounters with the subsurface to work out which places were occupied first and which places were occupied last. And the presence of the black sand, the presence of the pottery is playing a role in that. I don't think these parallel chronologies are very concerning to people in Orokolo Bay. As I've said, they already have these parallel chronologies of Popo being a cosmological origin site and also being a genealogical site situated within a migration chronology. And I think this is just going to hopefully add some more richness to the picture. Okay. Another thing to mention, I think, about the archaeology here is a pretty remarkable kind of intergenerational aspect of how this project came about. And so this is at the site of myriad, and this is one of the last sites we excavated. And at this site, the young guys that I was working with from the Kaivakovu village, they said to me, we really want to dig this site because we know the elders talk about this place as being an Aravo site, but we don't know all of the stories. So we actually want to get below the surface and find out what's in the ground. So as we're digging, we're finding some really interesting things, sort of, pig bone and pottery and the like. But as we come down to the really lower levels, we find the kind of traces of post holes, which the whole team really interpreted as being evidence of an ancestral Aravo being present at that place. And Larry Lacko in particular took a real interest in this. He was sort of regularly photographing things that came up during the excavations. And every night he was going down to the village, which is sort of 3-kilometre trek across some crocodile-infested rivers. So we weren't making that journey all the time. But he was going and visiting his uncle Hoey and saying, Hoey, look at these pictures, look at what we're finding, can you tell me the stories? And so Hoey was telling him the stories, and eventually this led to us, to Hoey inviting us to talk to us about the history of this particular place. And so there was a remarkable kind of recursive aspect there of intergenerational learning and sort of these young guys taking ownership of the archaeology and sort of using it to understand aspects of their past that they felt they wanted to know more about. Okay. So in terms of some global examples that are kind of in the same vein or are similar in practice to this, let's head pretty close to Orokolo Bay in the Papua New Guinean highlands. And so you can see here, this is all from Chris Ballard's 1995 PhD research with Huli people in the southern highlands of Papua New Guinea. And so for his PhD, Chris Ballard was really looking at the ways in which Huli communities understood their sacred geography, the ways in which they mapped themselves onto the landscape by digging drainage ditches, maintaining those ditches and associating those with their genealogies. The interesting thing here is that Huli communities regularly encounter buried stratigraphy in their drainage ditches, and among that stratigraphy is thin layers of light green, grey, sandy tephra buried beneath the surface. And so alongside the genealogies, these strata are evidence, they're also reminders of a specific epoch, a time of darkness in Huli oral traditions. They describe events when the sky darkens and a sediment called sky stuff, or dapindu, covers the ground. And so that these events occurred in the past is held by Huli to be an unquestionable fact. And so like the residents of Orokolo Bay, the Huli use these once hidden strata with cultural meanings to construct and make sense of the spatiality and temporality of certain events that happened in their past. And Russell Blong has also done a lot of work on this back in the 70s, I think, documenting these kind of stories across the highlands of Papua New Guinea. And he really showed that these stories are closely correlated with the distribution of tephras that lie beneath the surface in this part of PNG. And so communities which were affected by this event maintain knowledge of it, and we might wonder whether the ever-present and distinctive strata play a key role in sustaining these oral traditions. Some other exciting work also by Chris Ballard, but moving over to Vanuatu and to the island of Tongoa, sort of in Vanuatu Islands there, and you can see on the map. And so Chris Ballard's been recently researching the ways in which people in Vanuatu tell stories about and remember a massive volcanic eruption of Kauai in the 15th century. So these narratives were first sort of written down, reified by Europeans in 1890, but they were told certainly far earlier than that. And so in a recent paper, Ballard has shown that people today can identify the ancient submarine caldera. You can see the location of where the eruption took place here and blew out this central part of the island, what was one island, which erupted more than 500 years ago. and people can still recount the names of settlements which were destroyed by this eruption. And so the residents of the island of Tongawa, which you can see here, they call on aspects of the landscape. Firstly, the shape of the landscape itself, where this part of the island was blown out as evidence of this dramatic event, but also they call on layers of reworked tephra, which are visible in sea cliffs, with layers of cultural material situated below, so older. They also use other kind of memory techniques and memorials, such as memorial trees, grave sites, and stone arrangements, which speak of when people returned to this part after the cataclysmic event. And of course, they also have the continued rumbling of submarine vents, which is a reminder of the ancient eruption. Okay, moving a very, very long way to the Mississippi. And we're talking here about American Indian sites of, particularly of Cahokia. Very nice sort of reconstruction of it here from the State's Archaeological Survey of Illinois. And sort of recent archaeological research by Timothy Paukatat and Susan Alt has shown evidence of ancient excavations within their recent excavations in this Mississippian region. And so particularly at this vast site of Cahokia, which dates to around AD 1050, and other sites in the region, sort of indigenous people were building vast mound structures here and temple sites, as you can see in the reconstruction. And the stratigraphy built up for these mounds is quite remarkable. It actually has sort of anthropic incorporations into the stratigraphy so that they create a contrasting aesthetic. So some of those layers will include ground up bone, ash or ochre, and the mounds themselves often contain burials. So it seems some of these early excavations were made to access old graves and to add items of material culture to them. So it's this literal engagement with the ancestors through excavation. And the other digs, like this one that I made a terrible copy of today, you can see the excavators have exposed a pre-Columbian excavation profile. So it's like actually in pre-Columbian times, people were digging down through this, and it looks like actually to read possibly or to engage with this stratigraphy, which was so striking. So it's got those interleaved coloured layers. And so we might wonder whether these specific soil layers had meanings which could be read by the excavators who exposed them. In Southeast Asia, Dennis Byrne has given thought to the ways in which people read the past into the surface and subsurface. In his archaeological travelogue surface collection, which I can highly recommend, Dennis Byrne developed the notion of the underground as a hidden dimension of the subsurface, of the surface. And so Dennis Byrne, in one of his case studies, talking about how in Bali today, people are aware of the presence of buried villages and ancestors, people who were killed in politically motivated violence in the mid-1960s. And so despite attempts by the political powers at the time to silence these events and enforce a culture of forgetting among the general populace, people are still aware of this subsurface realm and the trauma associated with that. And their memories are maintained through encounters with subtle traces that still remain on the surface. So in this sense, the subsurface can play a role in remembering the past, even without regular re-engagements with those strata and digging beneath the surface. That's just a different kind of case study there. And Dennis Byrne helpfully summarises some of the key differences between the non-Western readings of the past I've been talking about and globalised archaeology, which we talked about right at the start. He's saying here, Indigenous peoples and voices from the non-West in general have been insisting that the past and present are a lived continuum, cutting across the niceties of absolute dating and stratigraphic sequencing. They seem to regard the past as always already immanent in the present. Ancient objects have agency, efficacy and personality of various kinds. The idea of a vital material past collapses the distinction between underground and the on-ground. And so I think there's quite a lot to learn from these examples, and I think you know, whether we call these archaeology or not is a question of semantics, certainly. but they definitely can't be lumped together as a unitary tradition. What we can be certain of is that people in disparate parts of the globe have been reading the past through things and landscapes, including through things which we tend to think of as the domain of archaeology, the subsurface and geomorphological features. So the non-Western traditions I've discussed here have diverse methods and aims, which are different, obviously, from those of archaeology. In Orokolo Bay, subsurface investigation is a habitual process whereby the ancestors are remembered, whereas the Mississippian digs are much more intentional, probably ritualized engagements with buried ancestors and structures. I think these alternative forms of archaeology, obviously they're fascinating in and of themselves, but they also give us a window into how people perpetuate history. So obviously in the Papuan Gulf prior to colonisation, continuing today, people communicated the history of their ancestors through oral tradition, much of which was passed down by village elders who would memorise these through lengthy cycles of songs. But I think things and landscapes have played a really key role in sustaining oral traditional knowledge, including the distribution of pottery sherds in ancestral village sites and also buried stratigraphy. I think this actually is going to play a key role in some ongoing debates in sort of anthropology and archaeology today. We have a lot of talk at the moment about, or I should say the debate around oral tradition is kind of splitting into two camps. We have reductionists who are saying that oral traditions only can be about the past 150 years and that's all people can pass on and remember. And then there's another camp saying that there are sort of 10 to 15,000 year old memories of events which happened in the past. And I think thinking about how Indigenous people may have read the subsurface and surface and the evidence there is actually going to be a key puzzle piece in how we understand exactly how these oral traditions were sustained and maintained and reconstructed. And I think certainly their kind of sophisticated readings of the landscape around would have at least enabled these kind of knowledges to be passed down. And I think that's currently missing from the discussion. So thank you so much for the invite to talk. That's pretty much what I have, and I think we'll have questions.
Thanks, Chris, very much. We will just try and get your image back up again. I'm not sure if your monitor showed you coming off, but you were lost about 20 slides ago. So you might want to reboot your video or see if we can get some other imaging through from you.
Okay.
No, we've got a black screen at the moment.
Oh wow!
Luckily, the audio was very good. Okay, look, we're going to just push on at the moment. Sven, you've got a comment?
Yes, thanks very much, Chris. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed the bit about the living, moving rocks, and particularly about the sort of multiple temporalities, which brings me to my comment in that I sort of wonder if alternative archaeologies is the right term to use, because it's generally a term associated with pseudo-archaeologies. So if you do a Google search and type in alternative archaeology, the first thing that comes up is Wikipedia pseudo-archaeology page. And I mean, what you're doing is emphatically not that, obviously. And there is a well-established scholarship on Indigenous archaeology, whether it means archaeology by non-Indigenous people of Indigenous pasts, by Indigenous people of Indigenous pasts, or some combination of those. Kind of tricky when some people don't like to be called Indigenous, but I think particularly there around understanding those kind of multiple temporalities and what you were getting onto with Dennis Byrne's work is incredibly valuable, and I don't think we want it undercut by using a term that's on the sort of lunatic fringe of archaeology. So that was just a comment from my side, but thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sven. I think it's a good point. I mean, in some ways, my use of alternative archaeologies comes from Bruce Trigger's work, which then sparked a whole bunch of archaeological historiographies. And his initial ones were kind of colonialist and nationalist archaeologies, and then that's since proliferated into many others. But I think I agree that it's probably not a term we should kind of settle on, but yeah.
Just to add to that, I suppose the other criticism could be that by calling something alternative archaeology, center archaeology as it's practiced, inverted commas, by normally or by the sort of colonial powers, if you like, and everything then deviates or derivates for that, and we probably want another term. But anyway, that's that's just one of those things. Thank you again very much. I find it all very fascinating, and similarly, gee, I hope things improve in PNG soon.
Thank you, Sven.
Thanks, Sven. Do we have another question? I was intrigued about your dichotomy between the reductionist, the 150-year oral traditionalist, and then the 15,000-year oral traditionalist. I think you're absolutely correct. I think this is how it's shaken down, and it's really quite unfortunate because, as you said and implied several times, the recursive ability of material culture, pottery, things like rock art, for people to refer to extant strata imagery and use that as mnemonic to reflesh or reactivate oral tradition is something which I would like to think is somewhere in between 150 years and 15,000. Did you want to make some comments on that?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think there's a lot that, the study of rock art has to say to that as well. And, you and your colleagues at UWA doing some fantastic work in that space. And I think, obviously, I just think if you read the literature around remembering and around how people revivify the past, it's not really talking about the kinds of things that we see in archaeology and the kinds of things we are used to working with people on. And I suppose that's where my kind of interest is in going, well, hang on, I'm not sure this is being talked about in this space. And so we have, memories, which, we can talk about memories, but that's really ignoring a whole load of literature about how people remember the past. And we can talk about memory props, and that tends to include, sort of art and big kind of visual things. But also there's potentially this kind of subsurface monumentality too, where strata are functioning as monuments in a sense.
Fascinating. Right, any more questions? Yep. For thought, can you say a bit about how the people in PNG perceive the power relationships and the work you and colleagues have been doing? Traditionally, archaeology is often part of the dominant discourse, and Indigenous discourses are not given the same credibility. How is this negotiated in PNG?
Interesting. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that question. Thank you, Martin. So firstly, can you say a bit about how people in PNG perceive power relationships, working our colleagues? Well, I think in PNG, it's an interesting place to work in that, we spent the first 2 days of our work really just talking about what archaeology was. So it's not that there was a keen local sense of what archaeology might do or how it might be useful or what it might achieve. And so we had to spend a lot of time talking about that. And so in a sense that, the power relationship, I think, is often and something that you get tied up in when doing that kind of work. And, me as a Westerner, but going there with Henry from Papua New Guinea, who's Papua New Guinean, is we look like mining executives. And that is really the kind of work that people in PNG are often engaged with, is people from outside come in, they extract things from the ground or from the landscape. And I think that does really impact how people think about power relationships and the like. And I think it's in returning the results and talking to people that power relationship is that is destabilized and people realize you're there for a relationship. And I was really privileged to see Rob Skelly delivering his results to the community. And that was a really fantastic process where they were actually interpreting everything they'd done together in language. And possibly Bruno wants to say something about that. That's what I would reflect on that. Thank you, Martin.
Great, thanks very much. Bruno, would you like to add some comment?
Yes, I could. This relates specifically with the Kauru area, just to the east of where Chris is working. But eventually it also gave rise to Chris's work. And that it's not the archaeologists that came over to do archaeological work there. It also, the whole work in that area in the 2000s started when one of the local communities in Epemeavo village found a sunken nugatoi, a sunken ship. And they raised it from under the water, and they called on the PNG National Museum to bring in archaeologists because they wanted that called upon, because they wanted tourists to come and see it so that they could make some money from the tourists. So the PNG National Museum called on us to go and have a look. And while we were there, and then we explained that what we do is not really related to tourism ourselves. The ships belong to them, and it's their business what they do with that. But in the process of doing that, they started talking about all these sites inland that had pottery coming out, the drainage channels and where they did the gardens, etc. And so they asked, please, we would like archaeology done there, because like Chris said, these are testimony to their ancestors and to the presence of their own historical past. And so at the time, one thing that I had said was that, well, look, I can't myself because of other commitments, but we could try and find some PhD people. It may take a year or 2 years or 3 years to find people to do this work, but then there would be a long-term commitment with the communities. And eventually Rob Skelly and then Chris Urwin ended up doing PhDs there. But again, this was specifically at the request of the communities, so that the projects, even the PhD projects themselves, are truly collaborative community projects driven by the communities. So I just thought they were important to mention to add to that.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Bruno. And I had no idea it was started by a Lugatoi find. That's quite extraordinary, seeing how large and complex they are in the first place. Jim Rhodes, you were mentioned. Are you still online? No, Jim's not responding there. So
yes, I am. Sorry.
Oh, good. Okay. Yep, you're good.
Hi, Jim.
That's fine. I've just confirmed that the elders that I spoke with about 25 to 30, maybe even 40 years before Chris was there, gave me the same origin stories that Chris wrote in his PhD. Those are the references that I would use. There's some consistency over time that these ideas have been had.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, speaking to the patrol officers, sort of another, I don't know, 70 years before that, Jim, which is pretty amazing. And Francis Edgar Williams's diaries, which are really a as yet untapped resource. I'm so sorry, everyone, about the slide. I have no idea what happened. I hope you weren't bored out of your minds. And I hope we can somehow get you a copy of the images, which really enliven a presentation, don't they?
No, the images were fine. We just lost you. We just lost your profile picture.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
I think that's fine.
Yeah, we can live with that.
Yeah. No,
they were beautiful images, actually, and really nice artwork, including the architect's rendering. That was quite extraordinary to see that totemical sacred geography, and then the clan estates and that spatiality through time was fascinating. And then, of course, the shore progrades to make it even more interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do we have any final comments? We're at time. No, and there are no, there's a copy of the presentation available. Yes, this is being recorded, so you'll be able to actually go back and see each and every one of the slides, and you'll be able to see Chris until slide 10. And you'll see a very charming black space, but very, very well modulated voice coming through the remainder. So that'll be there. There's lots of thanks coming through here. Yes, Jim.
Sorry, Chris hasn't mentioned that he's published this material already in 2 different places.
Right. Would you like to mention?
It's better to have the book than the movie, I think.
Do the plug now, Chris.
Yeah. Well, it's some of this is published in the Journal of Social Archaeology, but the book is actually forthcoming. So that's May next year. So plug that in advance, and that's with the University of Hawaii Press. That's very exciting, but it's a bit far away for people maybe to plan. But thank you, Jim, for making that aware.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much. We're at time now. Just noting that you are a member of CABAR, and I acknowledge the other parties that contributed to this talk today. Thanks for persevering with the technical glitches, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
And that's finished.